Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 3, Infancy and Toddlerhood. So, I want to begin with the endocrine system. We touched on this in the last chapter. In the endocrine system, well, the part of it that I'm focused on, and I want you to focus on, is the HPA system. Again, that's the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, adrenal gland system. Genetic and environmental forces are always working together. Even if you inherit a genetic predisposition to be tall, without proper nutrition, you are less likely to reach your full growth/developmental potential. And we discussed that in the previous chapter. Endocrine glands secrete chemicals called hormones directly into the bloodstream. The pituitary gland is a critical endocrine gland. It triggers a release of hormones and it produces growth. Ovaries and testes secrete testosterone, androgen, and estrogen/progesterone, which stimulate the production of growth hormones. So for the pituitary gland, I don't want you to think that the hormones secreted by the pituitary gland are only negative. The pituitary gland and cortisol specifically is implicated in growth within an individual. Okay. One way to conceptualize stress, and it's not perfect, but it's reasonable, is good stress versus toxic/bad stress. Good stress is related to personal growth. It's challenging, but not overwhelming. It's, positive stress, more short term. So the idea here is that we all face obstacles in life, and those obstacles provide us with an opportunity to grow, to develop solutions, critically evaluate our where we are in life, problem solve, etc. So it's, stress is needed for development. This is in contrast to toxic/bad stress, which is strong, frequent, or prolonged activation of the body's stress response system in the absence of the buffering protection of supportive adult relationship. So we touched on buffering in the last chapter. Buffering, again, or protective factors are a set of, well, the name kind of gives it away, protectors. They protect an individual, whether they be adult or child, from the harmful effects of toxic/bad stress. Toxic bad stress harms physical and cognitive growth. And again, we touched on adverse childhood experiences, that is ACEs, which include child abuse, neglect, parental substance abuse, maternal depression, economic depression, war, culture, and cultural upheaval. Next, the brain and nervous system. Neurons consist of the cell body, which is the soma, and then we have the dendrites and the axons. Myelination, and white matter gets its name from myelin. It looks white. It speeds transmission of neural communication, and it begins prenatally. The prefrontal cortex does not become fully myelinated until adolescent or early adulthood. So, like I hope I've emphasized throughout this course, is that development is a lifelong process, and you see many of these important neural structures continue to develop well into an individual's 20s, and in this case, myelination. It's linked with rapid cognitive improvements, and ACEs and prenatal stress decrease myelination. So again, I talked about last chapter that it's not just the number of neurons, but the efficiency, the speed of transmission that is associated with these rapid, in this case, written down here, cognitive improvements, but also social improvements and other types of improvements as well. And like I said, ACEs and prenatal stress decrease myelination. So again, one way, a marker, a biological marker by which we know that ACEs are harmful to an individual's development and more specifically, neural development. Infant brains growth. At birth, the brain is about 250 grams, so about half a pound. 1 year reaches 750 grams, so kind of self-explanatory. Brains are growing fast. Compared to adult size, newborn brain is approximately 33% of the adult size at birth, and then at 90 days, about 55%. Most of the neural activity is occurring in the cortex, or the thin outer layer of the brain, involved in voluntary activity and thinking. The cortex is divided into two hemispheres, and each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. And I'm just going to briefly go over this, looking at specifically right now the frontal lobe. And it oversees and organizes most other brain functions. It's kind of called executive functioning. The motor cortex is part of the frontal lobe, which is responsible for movement. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for thinking, planning, and language. Broca's area, a language area that helps control speech production, is also located in the frontal lobe. Next, the central nervous system. Another lobe is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is specialized for touch and perception. It helps track objects' location in space and relays visual and touch information to the motor cortex. Damage to this area can result in unilateral neglect. And there's a famous case in psychology of this, Mrs. S. And she had a stroke on the right, within her right parietal lobe. And she would only put makeup on only the right side of her face, but ignore the left side of her face. That is because the hemispheres control the opposite sides of the body. So stroke on the right side means she, Mrs. S, had an inability to kind of perceive the left side of her face. And you can see this with dogs. And if you click this image, a dog with damage to the parietal lobe will only, if it's the right parietal lobe, uh, the dog would ignore food on the left side of in his or her bowl. And obviously, this presents many health risks because a individual may only eat half their food, and they're getting half their food, so they may become malnutrition. Methods for assessing infant perception. So this is how researchers try and figure out how infants are engaging in perception. And there's a few different ways they go about this. Habituation is one of this. Process of responding less strongly over time to repeated stimuli measures how long an infant becomes bored, how quickly a new stimulus captures infant's attention. So they'll just hold up whatever. These are my headphones. They'll just hold up this headphone and they'll just stare. They'll just calculate how long an infant will just stare at these headphones. And when they get bored, and then they'll hold up a different object and they'll look to see how quickly an infant will change their attention from one item to another. Preferential looking, use eye tracking to determine which object an infant prefers to look at. So present an infant with two objects at the same time, hook them up with an eye tracking technology, which tracks the eye movements of an infant. And you can see, exact a millisecond, how quickly an infant looks at a particular item and for how long. Evoke potentials, measure electrical activity. So you put electrodes on an infant's scalp, and you can measure based on a particular electrode on a particular part of the infant's brain. You can measure the brain activity or an estimate of the brain activity of a particular brain region. So the benefit of that is that you can, why that method is efficient is because you can see up to the millisecond of how the electrical responses of the brain, but it's less precise because obviously it's just on scalp. And operant conditioning, once the response is well established, researchers can examine the conditions under which infants will or won't continue to produce behavior. So the idea here is that you just condition an infant to respond a certain way. Usually they hook an infant's foot up to some kind of toy or something, and a child will realize through time, through trial and error, that if they kick their feet, then this toy lights up or something along those lines, and they learn that way. Vision, how does it work? Eye takes in stimulation in the form of light. Human visible spectrum is a narrow band of light that we respond to. Other animals have different, more restricted light spectrums. Our eyes convert light into electrochemical signals. From the first minutes of life, a newborn can detect changes in brightness and visually track a slow-moving object. Pretty straightforward. Now, what can infants see exactly? Visual acuity is one way to determine that, and that's the ability to perceive detail. At birth, infants are 40 times worse than adults, and improves to 2100 vision, still pretty rough in the first month. It's equivalent of a giant E on the top of a vision chart, and vision is blurry unless within 1 feet of the infant. So if you're pretty far away from the infant, you're making all kinds of noise, God knows what that infant's seeing because they ain't seeing you. You can see on the right-hand side kind of what an infant is working with. In a visual combination, it's the ability of the lens of the eye to change shape to bring objects at different distances into focus. And that ability is kind of, well, not exactly linear, but it develops semi-linearly. So with age, an infant has better ability to focus on specific objects. What can infants see? Color vision is present at birth, but they cannot discriminate between some color differences. Sensory receptors on the retina are not yet mature, so their deficiencies or their developmental stage really of vision is related to specific receptors within their brain. Newborns can perceive light and dark objects, focus on nearby objects, and see simple patterns. Oh, the ear. I mean, some people love the ear. My girlfriend loves ear biochemistry. Not me personally, not a fan. But infant hearing. Hearing more developed than vision at birth, preterm babies may be at risk for later attention and language problems due to underdeveloped auditory systems. So the idea is if an infant can't hear, how are they going to interact with their mother, their father, their family, their caregiver? And, that could negatively impact them. How does hearing work? Molecules, moving air molecules enter the brain and cause the eardrum to vibrate. Vibrations transmitted to the cochlear and the inner ear. So basically, they're just hair, uh, like hair cells within the ear, and they convert electrical signals the brain interprets as sounds. Preterm babies who are exposed to womb-like sounds in neonatal intensive care units develop larger auditory cortex than preterm babies. So some studies, I'm not sure what the long-term implications are of this, but some studies have found that preterm infants, which are at risk, I should say, so this is definitely more valuable for preterm infants who are underdeveloped because they did not undergo the full gestational developmental period. One way to help them catch up, developmentally, is to expose them to sounds that are womb-like within the ICU to kind of simulate that prenatal environment. Okay, next looking at infant hearing preferences. Young infants show a preference for speech over non-speech sounds. So this is just kind of a biological predisposition, a species-specific trait that helps foster socialization within humans. Humans are social species, and this, infants immediately show signs of preferring speech over non-speech sounds. Newborns recognize vowel sounds from their native language they're exposed to in the womb, and humans are biologically capable of learning any language with development. They become more sensitive to their own language. So this goes back to previous slides, and that's in the beginning of development. In the beginning, their development is undifferentiated. But with time, due to environmental influences, development becomes specialized. You on a biological level are literally adapting to your specific environment, in this case, language. Okay, now looking at the touch, temperature, and pain senses, premature babies who are systematically stroked over their entire body gain more weight, or more relaxed, and have more regular sleep patterns. So kind of a relaxation method. Newborns are sensitive to warmth, cold, pain, and pain is responsive to learning. Infants who have already had their heels pricked show a larger response to having blood drawn. So the idea here is that infants learn. They see that needle coming the first time, they have no idea what that is, what's going down. But that second time, they know that they're about to be withdrawn. Infant taste. Babies can distinguish sweet, bitter, and sour taste at birth. Infants show a preference for sweets. Flavor preferences are highly responsive to learning. Eating food makes us appreciate it more. Greater exposure to a variety of flavors during infancy can lead to more adventuresome later life eating. So, how you eat as an infant is kind of, it's thought to be related to your adventuresome eating later on in life. Moving on to infant smell, infants will turn away from vinegar smells. They prefer the smell of their own amniotic fluid. Exposure to similar smells can calm newborn infants when caregivers are away, and infants and mothers can recognize their mothers by smell. So just a smell helps babies and parents get to know each other. Again, all pretty straightforward. Moving on to nutrition. In the 1970s, only 1 in 4 mothers nursed their newborns, an all-time low. 79% of new mothers breastfeed, 49% are still breastfeeding by age 6. So again, historical differences with time, things go up and some things go down. Numerous advantage of breast milk over formula, fewer ear infections, lower risk of ovarian cancer, etc. For premature babies, breast milk has been referred to as more of a medicine than a food because of the positive effects of their immune system. So again, premature babies who did not have the opportunity to go through full development prenatally, breast milk is related to kind of catch up growth in their immune system. Young women, poor women, and those with less education are less likely to breastfeed than other women for a variety of reasons: time, knowledge, stress, depression, etc. The Clemson University Cooperative Extension recommends not feeding infants solid food until the child can sit up, can hold his head up, show interest, is still hungry, is able to turn away from food. So kind of these are just some guidelines for when you should wean a child off breast milk, according to Clemson University. Next. So let's look at malnutrition around the world. Post-colonial countries, I'm just referring to them as that because a lot of people say developing countries, but it's kind of a vague term to me. I'm not really sure what they're developing towards. So I just use post-colonial countries, generally those who gained independence in the 1960s and 50s. Post-colonial countries are increased risk for 2 types of malnutrition and wasting. That's infantile marasmus, starvation due to lack of calories, children who do not receive adequate nutrition, lose body fat. Babies who are breastfed are much less likely to be at risk for malnutrition than those bottle fed. Then we have kwashiorkor, pretty good pronunciation. I did speak a little Swahili for a while, forgot most of it now. After weaning, children who have diets deficient in protein, also known as disease of the displaced child, often occurs after another child has been born and taken over breastfeeding. Results in a loss of appetite and swelling of the abdomen of the baby. So the idea basically here is that a child is unable to fulfill their protein nutritional requirements. It is often associated when a mother has to breastfeed multiple children at the same time, so a child is at greater risk for malnutrition. All right, let's just talk about theories of cognitive development. There are numerous explanations of how we acquire the ability to learn, think, communicate, and remember over time. So there's kind of 3 key features of what separates different cognitive theories. One is stage-like versus continuous changes in understanding. And we talked about this in a little bit in chapter 2, but sudden bursts in knowledge followed by stability versus gradual increases. So kind of just grinding up that hill versus a big jump, taking that like a staircase. You're getting new abilities at each level versus, again, gradually going up that hill. Domain general versus domain specific accounts. Changes affect most or / all areas of cognitive function in tandem versus cognitive skills develop independently at different rates across different domains. So the idea here is that growth is related to kind of just a generalized development in the brain versus the specific area of the brain. So I don't know, the prefrontal cortex developing, myelinating, being associated with executive function, planning, solving skills. And principal source of learning, is it the physical experience moving in the world versus social interaction, parent engagement versus biological maturation? That is innate programming of cognitive skills. So what are abilities? So what is driving learning? Is it biology? Is it a child's ability to move through the world? Is it social interactions? Now, obviously, we know that all of these play a role, but the emphasis, uh, theories have different ideas of which are more valuable. They emphasize more within their theory of development. Piaget's constructionist approach. Piaget studied children using the clinical method, and he asked himself, why do children give wrong answers? Flexible question and answer technique used to discover how children think about problems. So Piaget was interested in why are kids dumb? So kids answer, he's talking to his children. That's what where most of his experiments were, dealing with his kids. And this dude is like, no, my kids are dumb and I want to know why. Because it's, it can't just be my kids. Other kids are making these errors. They gotta be. And he did look at other children eventually. But so he's really focused on why children screw up on these set of tasks that some of which we'll go over. Contemporary researchers consider this method imprecise because it does not involve asking standardized questions. So the flexibility within his tasks allow for kind of, you know, possibly more real world responses and more an array of responses. But because it's more flexible, everything has trades off. It's less precise, and it's not as, thus it's not as standardized. So Piaget's theories, intelligence is a basic life function that helps an organism adapt to its environment. It reflects his background in biology. So what is intelligence but a organism adapting to its environment? Piaget viewed infants as active agents in their own development. He uses stage theories who believe skills are domain general. So go back to the previous slides if you need to, but he believes that infants are active agents. They're interacting with the world through their acquired physical abilities and their improved cognitive growth. And he's a stage theorist. So once you hit a certain stage, then bam, you've got these cognitive abilities and you're off to the races. And you have within those cognitive abilities strengths and weaknesses at each stage. And he thought the end point of cognitive development is the ability to reason logically about hypotheticals. Schemes and schemas. Similar to having a set of rules or procedures that can repeat and generalize across various situations. During their second year, children develop symbolic schemes, use internal mental symbols to represent the world. So basically, the children, he believed, develop schemas. So within a certain circumstance, you go to a restaurant and you expect to be waited on, or you expect a host to sit you down, and then a waiter comes or whatever. Well, we obviously know that's not the case for every restaurant, but our schema tells us otherwise. So infants rely more on these schemas, which leads to particular errors within particular tasks, as we'll see momentarily. Okay, so how does intelligence develop? So we know why Piaget believes intelligence develops, and that's because organisms have to adapt to their environment. But how does it? Piaget took an interactionist perspective on nature and nurture. Children actively create knowledge by building schemes from their experiences using two inborn nature, so that is nature intellectual functions. So Piaget believed that there's an interaction approach between nature and nurture. Children are building schemes, as we say, kind of these recipes of how the world operates through these two functions, and that is organization. Children systematically combine existing schemes into new and more complex ones. Ideas and actions are logically ordered and interrelated. And adaptation, the process of adjusting to the demands of an environment, two complementary practices. So you can see kind of on the right here, a child is banging his favorite is a favorite scheme used by babies to explore the world. Simulation occurs when they incorporate new objects into the scheme. A combination occurs when the new object doesn't fit the scheme. So the idea here is, oh, I like banging stuff. And banging stuff teaches me things. Oh, wait, I just banged this egg, and this egg is going to be broken. So I am going to change my idea that banging or being, throwing shit around is the way to learn things. Continue on in how intelligence develops, Piaget thought that we are motivated to reduce cognitive conflict through equal equilibration. The process of achieving mental stability where internal thoughts are consistent with the evidence received from the external world. This equilibrium stimulates cognitive growth and the formation of more adequate understanding. Intelligence then develops from the interaction of the individual with the environment. So the idea here is that, okay, I have a particular understanding of the world, and what do I do with that? Do I uh, fit this new information that I've received from interacting in the world within my previous schema, or do I change my schema? Okay, and we can see that example here. This child calling a dog correctly their dog, then pointing to their cat and say, "Oh, that's a dog." But then the parent, the father, tells the child that no, that's actually a cat, you fool. So theoretically, a child could say, "No, Dad, you're so wrong. That is actually a dog." Or they can accommodate and begin to understand that all four-legged creatures within their house are not dogs. So that's kind of they're updating, they're modifying their previous schemas to um, make it more reflective, more accurate within the world. And that goes back to that disequilibrium. Infants have an innate desire to make things kind of like logical. All right, so another example, a child who believes the Earth is flat. She might assimilate this new knowledge by picturing a flat disk like a coin. However, a child confronted with a globe will have a difficult time assimilating this information into her conception of the Earth as flat. When a child's existing beliefs can no longer assimilate new information, they undergo accommodation. So the child believes the Earth is flat. They look at a coin. They're like, "See, look at this. This coin is flat. Therefore, everything's flat." Then they're shown a globe, and the child's like, "Oh, Earth is not flat." And therefore I have not gone on YouTube yet to learn about flat Earth theory and believe that. So I'm going to accurately believe that the Earth is indeed not flat. And I'm going to accommodate uh, this new information into my previous schema and update it and make it more accurate. Okay, moving on to object permanence. According to Piaget, newborns lack an understanding of object permanence. This is why you can play peekaboo and the child will be amazed. They think their mom, their dad, their grandma is gone forever. They literally cannot cognitively process the fact that you are still present. Children, 8 to 12-month-old children, tend to make A, not B errors, and the idea here is that you hide something in a basket or something, and then you show to the child that you moved their toy from that basket to whatever, a laundry hamper. Well, a child will actually look for the toy in the original basket rather than the laundry hamper. However, later research found that this is not always true. Depending how difficult the task is, 2-month-olds actually show evidence of understanding or possessing object permanence. Now look at the pros and cons of Piaget. He asks important questions that continue to guide the study of cognitive development. Learning is active and not passive, and taught us that young children think differently than older people do. Continuing on, understanding cognitive abilities of infants and young children, Piaget failed to distinguish between competence and performance. Are they unable to perform, uh, or is poor performance because of his task? So the idea here is, wait, do children not possess this ability, or is it Piaget's specific task? And in fairness to Piaget, that's kind of a common problem. Is it a task situation that the child is struggling with, or do they really not possess that ability? He wrongly claimed that broad stages of development exist. Transitions between stages are often lengthy and subtle. Knowledge is an all or nothing, more gradual. Not clear when a child has entered a new stage because a child makes out one thing. So the idea here is that he laid out different kinds of abilities uh, that can only exist within a particular stage. But there's evidence that children perform some skills at a certain level while they perform other skills at a different level. So you can be, proficient at something, at one thing. You can have an amazing object permanence, but garbage assimilation, for example. And finally, failure to adequately explain development. He did a better job describing development and explaining how it comes about, and giving limited attention to social influences of cognitive development. He did not believe that children learn much from interaction with adults, and cross-cultural research has been it's been unable to replicate many of Piaget's claims. So the uh, idea here is that he did not believe that parents play much of an influence in a child's life at all. It's just specifically how a child interacts through active engagement with their physical environment. And cross-cultural research has found different rates of development, different abilities at different ages than Piaget found. And in the magic of television, you should see on the previous slide that I wrote that cross-cultural has replicated, but magically now your PowerPoint will say that it hasn't replicated. So moving on to child amnesia, few autobiographical memories of events that occurred during the first years of life stay with a child, and there's different theories of why that happens. One is that working memory, infants and toddlers may not have enough space in working memory, needed to hold multiple pieces of information, needed to encode it and consolidate memory, and we'll get to that momentarily. But one theory is that their working memory sucks. They can't keep certain events going on in their brain around them in their brain at the same time, and then therefore it doesn't really get stored in the brain. Sociocultural support, mother-toddler conversations about past events increases memory, may be rehearsal effects. So this some researchers have found that if a family talks to the toddler about their day, or makes them recap their memories, they have better ability to recall their memories. And the rehearsal effects just refers to the fact that the more you think about something, the more you devote cognitive resources to something, the more entrenched that memory becomes. And neurogenesis is another theory. The birth of new cells in hippocampus replaces older cells and possibly older memories. So this argument is that new cells or cellular systems hold certain memories, and due to neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, those cells are replaced, and with them, those memories are gone as well. Fuzzy trace theory, theory of infant amnesia. Children store verbatim and general accounts of an event separately. Verbatim information is unstable and likely to be forgotten. As children get better, they increasingly use just fuzzy trace memories. So children will rely on these very specific details that we typically ignore or don't put much emphasis on. We remember things based on what generally happened. What is literally the gist of it? And as children shift their cognitive strategies to more gist oriented memories, they become better at memorizing things. Their memories are retained longer, or at least have the capability of being retained longer. Basic components of language. Language is a communication system in which a limited number of signals can be combined according to rules. Phonemes, basic units of sound, and morphemes, basic units of meaning that exist in a word. So it can be full words, dog, or re-ish. So recall means do it again, pink-ish, kind of, moderately so. There's probably about 100 phonemes, and each language only uses a subset ranging from 15 to 60. So even though we have the capability of producing 100 of these basic units of sound, most languages rely on only 15 to 60 of them. So continuing on, the basic components of language, we have syntax, which is the systematic rules for forming sentences. Fang, Fred, bit versus Fred, bit, Fang. For English, obviously, the second one is syntactically correct. Understanding the meanings of sentences requires knowing the semantics. Move beyond literal meaning, semantics. Meaning would derive from words of sentences shared with scream with jealousy. So if you tell that to an infant, or well, someone who's capable, a little older, 3-year-old or whatever, 2-year-old, they'll think that the child is literally green because they do not have semantics. Pragmatics, rules for specifying how language is used appropriately in different social contexts, use contextual factors. So do you laugh in the middle of your grandma's funeral? A 3-year-old might probably doesn't know the answer to that. And prosody, how the sounds are produced, melody of speech, because it includes pitch, can use the same word in different meaning. So the word dog versus dog or dog. So put the tone that we put on words conveys certain meanings. Intentional vocalizations. Newborns show preference for speech over non-speech sounds, as I stated. Word segmentation, the ability to detect a word, any stream of speech, demonstrated by 7.5 months. Come to understand that cat represents a unit that is separate from other words. So the idea is I can say blah, 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 like, make noise or whatever, but then I say a word eventually within my jargon, and infant will come to recognize that, oh, that's an English word. And they come to understand that a cat is like some kind of unit, some kind of thing, a four-legged creature, or, depending on how you feel about Piaget's theory, a specific cat, it's a unit, that exists. And cooing, repeating vowel-like sounds, 6 to 8 weeks of age, content or in response to a parent's happy voice. So infants will coo in response to feeling content. Now looking at babbling, repeating consonant vowel combinations such as baba begins around 4 to 6 months of age. Comprehension occurs before production of language development. So a child is able to understand what you're saying before they can form the words. One theory for that is that children have not mastered the fine motor skills or maybe not possess the muscles necessary to form specific words, but they can understand them. 8-month-old babies babble with an accent, restrict babbling sounds to phonemes in the language they hear. So the idea is that infants babble in an accent, and they babble sounds that are common within their language. So infant sign language. I always find this very interesting. Deaf children. The earlier the better applies here. The mastery of the syntax and semantics of sign language was greatest among students exposed to it in infancy or early childhood. Those who learn ASL later in their development mastered it better, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the idea here is that there's a few ideas. That one is that if infants naturally want to communicate with the world and they're going to naturally develop language. So if their parents are deaf and they speak sign language, they will create, just like vocalizations, but through sign language. So they'll create their own signs or, kind of signs that are related to, signs that parents use. So they babble through sign language. And those who are exposed to sign language, just like any other language, those exposed to deaf children that are exposed to sign language at a younger age show greatest syntax and semantic abilities. Hollow phrases, a single word utterance used by an infant that represents an entire sentence worth of meanings. The same words can have multiple meanings. Getty means that is spaghetti or I want spaghetti. Depends on the way the word is said. And we kind of mentioned that a little earlier, but you can say, just like it says, it can mean give me my dinner, or I've just thrown my dinner across the floor. Infants' first words are spoken about 1 year of age, and first 50 words are common nouns representing objects and people. And that may be because nouns are easier to imagine conceptually than a verb. So infant language abilities, we mentioned this a little bit with Piaget, and there's kind of two fails going on here. We have overextension, underextension. And overextension could mean that everything with 4 legs or any like mammal or animal is a cat. Underextension means that only my dog is a dog and everything else, every other kind of dog is, whatever, something else. Getting semantics correct, hypothesized to be mainly a matter of discriminating similarities and differences, categorizing animals by size, shape, and sounds. So getting the semantics correct is literally you're related to your ability to categorize, in this case, animals within their correct categories. Next, telegraphic speech. This occurs between 18 and 24 months of age. Early combination of two, three, or more words. Contain critical content words, so no want. So we know what they're focusing on key features of language. So no, straightforward, and want. Don't give it to me. Functional grammar emphasizes semantic relationships among words, the meaning being expressed in the function served by sentences. So that's telegraphic speech is related to functional grammar. It's the things you're saying are purely kind of well, functional. It's a utilitarian kind of approach to language at that age. All right, looking at the neural components of language, I'm just going to look at a couple areas. The left hemisphere of the brain shows increased neural activity when listening to speech, typically the Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's is associated with speech production, Wernicke is associated with comprehension with language. Now, these are actually not exactly correct, but for the purpose of this class, it's good enough. These are generalizations, and they'll do right now. Now, typically how this, or historically how this has been studied is that if a person has, get hit with a metal pipe to one part of their brain, and oh wait, they can't produce speech now. Oh, I guess that area is involved with producing speech. But within increases of technology, we've been better able to pinpoint specific neural networks that are involved within speech production and all neural networks for all psychological processes. Critical periods for language learning, language deprivation, narrow windows of time in development during which an organism must learn an ability if it's going to learn it. Learning a second language is influenced by age of exposure, most dramatic for syntax and pronunciation. So the idea here is that there is a critical period of language, and if you do not learn language during that period, then you are going to struggle to do so. That's why it's critical. It's kind of like a time where it has to happen, or you don't have the ability to do so, or it'll be hampered in some way. Home signs show the influence of nature and nurture on language. System of signs invented by children who were deaf and born of hearing parents and therefore received no language input. Never develop full language if not exposed to sign language. So again, deaf children is always interesting to me. And these children in Nicaragua kind of developed their own language. Now, what exactly is a language is a little up for debate. But over time, this language has developed, or these signs have developed. And researchers argue that it's definitely resembles a language and is pretty close to a language. Cross-culturally, a group of that's basically what I'm talking about, whose teacher could not sign invented a way to communicate through made-up signs. So this kind of this innate instinct to develop a language shown, another demonstration cross-culturally. Critical periods for language. There's no strict critical period for language development in humans, but rather a more general sensitive period. So the difference is critical periods. This is definitely more seen in animal models, non-human animal models, non-primate animal models. The idea is that if you don't get a certain input from the environment, if you don't learn a certain skill within a certain period of time, you can't learn it. Versus sensitive period, the idea there is that certain organs, certain psychological constructs are easier to learn during certain time periods, and it's a period of rapid growth, but you can still develop that psychological construct later on in life. It might just be not as efficient or a little different. The younger you are, the better you will learn a new language. Less is more theories. Adults may be trying to impose organization and structure on learning, which make it more challenging. Children who have less knowledge and those skills, so they start from the ground up. So the idea here is that the parents, you've lived your life, you have certain analytical skills, you have certain structures, you have certain ways of thinking. Children, dumb, they don't know anything. So they're able to take in more of the environment and learn things as is, instead of me trying to force my way of thinking on, in this case, like language. So my structure, my syntax on this new language. Okay, theories. Now let's jump into some theories of language. The first we're going to look at is nativist nurture, suggests that children are born with some basic knowledge about how language works. one key component is universal grammar, which is a system of common rules and properties for learning any of the world's languages. 75% of language use the same basic word order. Chomsky's language acquisition device is kind of one of the OGs of this perspective of language development, and is a hypothetical organ in the brain which nativists believe functions to sift through language, apply universal rules, and specialize the system to specifics of a language spoken in the environment. So it's this organ that adapts, that's capable of recognizing any language, and it becomes more specialized through the languages that a child interacts with. And kind of a famous concept within native arguments is the poverty of the stimulus. Children could not acquire complex communication systems with the limited language input they receive. The environmental stimulus of a language input is too impoverished to support the linguistic output that we see emerge. Children typically progress through the same sequence at roughly the same ages and make similar errors, such as a species-wide maturational plan. Young children learn native languages with ease, but struggle later to learn second language. So the idea here is it's nativist. There is a species-wide plan that acts at a biological level that determines the sequence and the trajectory of development, in this case, language. And the argument is, okay, listen, when you're talking to a child, are you correcting every little synaptic thing that's going on, every grammar issue, every, correcting them overextending, underextending? You do sometimes, but the amount of things that they are learning is not being directed by the parent. It's not being corrected. And Chomsky was famous. You want to look up some classic beefs in language. Look at Chomsky's brutal critique of Skinner. And Skinner's approach would be, okay, well, language is reinforced, but Chomsky basically argues that's impossible and nonsense. So theoretical accounts of language acquisition, social pragmatics, suggest that specific aspects of the social environment structure language learning. Children use the context of conversation to infer its topics, social context, and communicative attention to others. So the social environment structures learning, and kind of straightforward. And children are able to infer things based on the context by which the communication is occurring. Requires assuming that infants understand a great deal about how other people are thinking. Learning by pointing because children recognize that the speaker's communicative goals are directed attention. Every time their caregiver points a Lego, he or she utters the same word. So the idea here is that the child has to understand that the perspective of their parents, that the parent is trying to has a goal to align words and objects within the environment. So Legos, saying the word Lego, pointing to the word Lego, and then seeing the Lego. Imitation suggests babies hear language used in systematic ways and learn to use language as adults use it. Does account for the generative nature of language. So if a language is a process of just imitating the learner, or sorry, whoever, the teacher, the parent, that does not and cannot account for the fact that language by definition is generative. You can give an infinite number of sentences producing new statements and thoughts. So how can a purely imitation framework of language development account for that? And it can't. All right, moving on to psychosocial development, looking at some temperament categories. Temperament is our innate characteristics of an infant. The idea here is that these are genetically based but environmentally influenced, and based on an infant's temperament, you can predict how they'll react in certain circumstances, and it serves as the foundation for later personality. There's three kind of broad categories that these researchers suspect, and that's easy temperament, kind of straightforward, easy. Difficult, active, irritable, slow to warm up. So initially kind of inactive, but over time they adjust and show more characteristics of an easy temperament baby. Dimensions of temperament. Rothbard, famous researcher, identified three dimensions of temperament. They're types versus dimensions, emphasized self-regulation, how easy infants become emotionally aroused, and how able they are to control or regulate their arousal. So so we have the three types, which is kind of the previous slide, and now we have kind of these three sliding scales on a continuum. Okay, so it's kind of that's types versus dimensions. So we have surgency versus extroversion, so kind of a scale. Where do you fall? Is well, we'll just make up something. A 0 is low extroversion, 100 is super extroversion. That's a tendency to be actively, confidently, energetically approach new experiences. Negative effectivity and effortful control, ability to focus and shift attention when desired. Goodness of fit, always interesting. Parents and child's temperament and parenting styles match, and communication and interactions can flow. This is the extent to which child's temperament is compatible with demands and expectations of the social world. So the idea here is that to have optimal goodness of fit, you want the environment and the household, parenting styles, etc., to match the temperament of an infant for optimal development. Prenatal stress, substance abuse, and genetics interact to shape temperaments. Postnatal environments help determine how adaptive particular temperamental qualities are. So, kind of straightforward, your postnatal, the environment around you, impacts how adaptive your temperament is to the environment. And so it's kind of up to adults, communities, countries, legislation, etc., to ensure that goodness of fit is possible. So one example is that a shy, inhibited children are likely to remain inhibited if their parents are either overprotected or angry and impatient, but can overcome inhibition if their parents create a good fit by preparing them for potentially upsetting experiences and making firm but reasonable demands. So let's say you got a shy child, and you're like, okay, I know my kid is shy, so I'm going to be super protective of him. I'm not going to introduce him to any strangers. He's not allowed to go outside. He's not allowed to do anything. Well, and that's not going to be long-term adaptive, obviously, because you are kind of solidifying that child's shyness, which is, fine, but in order to interact with in the world, you need some ability to not be shy. You have to be able to, work or, interact with people uh, in a way that allows you to function within the world. Thus, if you can't do that, your shyness then becomes maladaptive. So what is personality? Defined as an individual's consistent pattern of feeling, thinking, and behaving. It's an organized combination of attitudes, motives, and values. There are dispositional traits, relatively enduring dimensions, or qualities of personality. And there are characteristic adaptations, more situation-specific and changeable aspects of personalities. Includes the motives, the goals, the plans, or schemes. It's the ways in which people adapt to their roles and environment. So there are kind of two different theories of, well, in kind of two different concepts of personality here, or at least personality being manifested in two different ways. That is dispositional, which is you are what you are, you're extroverted, you're going to be extroverted no matter where you are, versus kind of this adaptation, straightforward, adaptation. It's, you're in a specific role where it requires me to be extroverted. I got to be on this mic, you got for whatever amount of time, 20 hours a semester, so I'm going to run my mouth. But if I don't have to run my mouth, then I'm going to be introverted. First, emotions and emotional regulation. So this researcher tried to define what are basic emotions, and they had independent raters describe an infant's emotions. And so what you do is you have a bunch of independent raters. You don't tell them what you're well, you don't reveal the scores or what it is, you're rating to other raters. And then you compare the results across raters, and if everybody's rating something as distressing or joy, and everybody agrees independently, then that's probably there's empirical evidence to suggest that that behavior is a basic emotion. So these researchers argued that basic emotions are biologically based and develop early in life and play critical roles in motivating and organizing behavior. Primary emotions are distinct basic emotions that emerge within the first 6 months of life. So whatever. So more, so one basic emotions, kind of day one stuff, more or less, and then primary emerging within the first 6 months, and that's baby showing contentment, interest, and distress. Within the first 6 months, six primary specific primary emotions evolved from these three. Self-conscious slash secondary emotions. After 18 months, self-conscious and secondary emotions emerge. Researchers argue that these emotions require self-awareness. So how can you be embarrassed if you really don't have like a concept of self? You have to be able to understand that I'm a self, I'm doing something that's weird or embarrassing, and therefore I'm embarrassed. Some researchers argue that primary emotions are only active patterns rather than true emotions until children develop self-consciousness and can have thoughts such as I'm scared of the dog. So the idea here is these researchers would argue, hey, yeah, cool, basic emotions actually aren't meaning anything. They're just a pattern of behaviors. And until again, you are self-conscious, you are self-aware, you not capable of feeling emotions because emotions are so based within the concept of self. So first emotions. Around 9 months of age, infants begin to use social referencing, which is a process whereby infants seek out information from others to clarify a situation and then use that information to act. The idea here is that one way that emotions and kind of personality or traits are passed down from parents to children is that children rely on the reaction of parents to specific circumstances to determine how they should act. So if a stranger approaches and the mother, father, family is freaking out or running away, they're going to think, oh, wait, this person is, trouble and I should run away as well. And they might overgeneralize it. They might think that all strangers are dangerous and run away from everybody at the grocery store, for example. Infants develop strategies for emotional regulation at the end of the first year. So infants can move away from upsetting events, pretty straightforward. So one way infants regulate emotion is they crawl away. Caregivers attachment, bonding, distinguished from attachment, a more biologically based process in which parent and infant form a connection through contact. So kind of just this really preliminary way of forming attachments through more touch through contact. Caregivers in infants develop synchronized routes, harmonious dance-like interactions between infant and caregiver in which each adjust behavior in response to each other. So kind of the infant and the mom, or and father for that matter, family for that matter, um, kind of understand each other's emotion, or infant kind of has this rudimentary understanding of what it is the parent's mood is, etc., and they respond in turn based on their understanding of caregiver's behavior. Attachment, four phases and four forms of attachment. The first is So attachment, we have four phases in forming attachments. We have undiscriminating social responsiveness, discriminating social responsiveness, true attachment, and goal-corrected partnership. So we go from infants, children, responding to voices and faces with any human interest in them and then children begin to show preferences for familiar companions, and they direct, their positivity and babbles towards companions, but they're still a little friendly with strangers. And then we move on to true attachment, which is thought to be the first real attachment, when infants follow mothers around, protest when she leaves. And then we finally have goal-corrected partnership, which is taking a parent's goal and plans into consideration. So we go from, no, I want my parent right here, right now, to, okay, no, this person is a human and they have other goals, and I'm going to take that into consideration when making my demands. And understanding that when this person leaves from work, they're not abandoning me. Exploratory behavior. The formation of a strong attachment has the positive effect of facilitating exploratory behavior. Caregivers act as a secure base, a point of safety from which an infant can feel they can venture from. safe haven an infant can return to for comfort if frightened. So what this means is that infants conceptualize a attachment, a strong attachment, as a base that from which they can explore away from their caregiver and return to if danger occurs. So it's kind of like a way of regulating their own emotions in dealing with the complexities and the scariness of the outside world. When there's a secure attachment, infants are more likely to explore and, if they're scared, return to their caregiver for comfort. And it allows basically for a positive way to explore the world. Quality of attachment, Ainsworth strain situation. So famous test. I actually administered this in Democratic Republic of Congo. First time ever. Watch out. Laboratory for procedure designed to evaluate attachment style. So basically, what happens is you put a infant and a mother in a room that neither one of them have ever experienced before or been in before, and it has a ton of toys, and the infant plays with the toys. And researchers, a group of independent raters, look at and rate kind of how comfortable an infant is with exploring the room. And then they have a stranger enter the room, and they kind of rate how an infant reacts to a stranger entering the room. Then they have the mother leave the room, and they rate that as well. And then they have the mother return, and they rate that as well. Based on the infant's behavior in these stages of the strange situation, researchers classify infants' attachment into 1 of 4 categories. And here are the 4. We have secure, we have resistant, we have avoidant, and we have disorganized. Secure attachment is an infant or a child welcomes close contacts, uses attachment object as a source of comfort, and dislikes but can manage separations. Resistant, an insecure infant caregiver bond of other intimate relationship characterized by strong separation anxiety, and a tendency to show ambivalent reaction to the attachment object. And avoidant, an insecure infant caregiver bond or other intimate relationship characterized by little separation anxiety. So it's kind of the opposite, well, not exactly the opposite, but a different form of insecure attachment. And that's one is, huge anxiety when a parent leaves versus I don't care. that I don't care that they left, and when they return, I'm not seeking comfort from that caregiver. And then disorganized, disoriented attachment is kind of like a mismatch between resistance and avoidance, kind of just chaos and confusion. The infant doesn't seem to know what he or she wants to do. And here's just a visual illustration of the different kinds of attachment. Secure, agree with the parents with positive emotions. Avoidant, pretty straightforward, they're avoiding the parents. Ambivalent, weary of strangers, and disorder is just chaos is an easy way to think about this. Now looking at avoidant attachment example, I'm not going to play this video. You can watch this on your own time, but this is kind of a video example of avoidant attachment. Now moving on to contact comfort. This is another famous study. Pleasurable tactile sensations provided by a soft and cuddly parent is more powerful contributor to attachment in monkeys than feeding. Also promotes human attachment. Many infants become attached to someone other than the infants who feed them. So this study kind of wanted to understand the impact or the how primates, and not humans in this case, but other primates, what do they value more? Do they value a mother who, is just an unwelcoming, kind of ugly model, but that has food, so, critical thing for survival, or do they are they more comfortable or are they more attached to an inanimate mother that has a nice face, is comfortable, but has no food? So, kind of from that like hard, like biological perspective, even though this is incorrect, you would think, oh, they want the food, who cares? But what did this researcher found that the monkeys spend more time with the comfortable layer of the fake monkey. That is, when they're exposed to something scary, the infants run to the fake nice monkey rather than the monkey with food. So that is that they um, find that the comfortable monkey, even though it doesn't have food, that comfort, that touch, is more valuable and a more secure base for that infant in times of danger than a monkey purely providing food. Reassuring physical contact plays a critical role in developing attachment. Quality of attachment. Caregiver contributions. Contact comfort promotes human attachment. Parents who are sensitive and responsive to baby's needs and emotional signals promote secure attachment. Infants' contributions. Relationships between infant temperament and quality of attachment are often weak. Caregivers who are responsive and just to their baby's quirks are able to establish secure relationships. Many infants are securely attached to one parent. So the idea here is that caregivers contribute to attachment. So obviously, you neglect your kid, you make them sleep outside, they're probably not going to be that attached to you. Infants also contribute. Um, so infants obviously has particular quirks. You can see the development of personalities, traits, or they act in certain ways at least from a very young age, and thus they can elicit certain responses from their parents. But parents who adapt to the quirks, the peculiarities of their specific children can still establish secure attachment. And just a figure to the right just kind of shows that depression is puts infants in the United States, at least for uh, it puts them at risk for not developing a secure attachment. And that's thought to be because you're depressed. You can't be in tune with your infant's emotional states. You're struggling yourself. So again, one way that parenting can impact the development of children. So let's look at some cultural and social context, some cross-cultural studies of attachment. And I've always found, kind of irritating that uh, the hype of secure attachment, obviously valuable in certain American contexts for sure, but you also will see this later with parenting styles, and that is that different styles, different temperaments are more adaptive in certain environmental circumstances. So, for example, in northern Germany, the most common attachment style was avoidant attachment, and this was viewed as the ideal. Northern German mothers associate avoidance with signs of early independence, a culturally valued trait. So, avoiding the mothers, not seeking them for comfort, was thought to be adaptive. It was thought it was the correct way for development. Israeli kibbutz set up a system of communal childcare to free the adults to spend more time doing economic productive work. So kind of this like kind of anarchist society of collective work. Children raised in the most traditional form of the kibbutz, starting at 3 months, spent their entire days and nights, with the exception of 3 hours dinner break with their parents. So basically, the idea here is that the infants spent most of their time with community members, not just a parent, and so that's going to impact their attachment style. And the most common form of attachment style in this area was anxious and ambivalent. Again, that was adapted for that particular culture, that particular economic system, that economic model. Some studies have found no avoidant attachments in Japanese samples and among the Dogon in West Africa, where infants are in constant proximity to their parents. So, although this kind of idea that there are four kind of attachment types, well, in some studies they're not four. Again, for in Dogon West, the Dogon ethnicity in West Africa, these there were no children with avoidant attachments, and in some studies as well, in some Japanese studies. Implications for early attachment. Studies of institutionalized Romania children adopted by American, UK, and Canadian families. Those who were adopted before 1 year of age had a good chance of becoming securely attached to their caregivers. After 1 year, high rates of insecure and disturbed attachment. So I actually, my mentor and my dissertation committee members, two of them actually worked on this project. This is a very long project. And basically there was A lot of children in Romania were institutionalized and had a lot of neglect, basically. And these children got adopted at different ages, 1, 2, whatever. And basically, the general finding is, and they've followed these children longitudinally, is that the more time spent in these institutions, the poor developmental outcomes for these children. So again, this kind of dosage duration effect. After 1 year, high rates of insecure and disturbed attachment. So there's kind of like these sensitive, or really some argue critical periods by which if you hit a certain or a certain amount of dosage, a certain amount of stress, a certain amount of neglect, then you're going to have a lifelong poor developmental outcomes. And there's all kinds of studies, if you Google this, related to brain activity, genetic expression, psychosocial development. It's a huge study. Now let's look at protective factors. Finally, a protective factor slide after talking about it for a couple chapters now. Outcomes of early risk depend on the quality of the postnatal environment. Low birth weight children are sensitive parenting and toddlerhood exhibited faster rates of improvement in executive function and were virtually indistinguishable from their peers. Cumulative risk with internalizing problems were buffered by adolescent religiosity and neighborhood collective efficacy in poor neighborhoods among Black teens. So what do we got here? So the idea here is that, okay, just for the sake of argument, okay, low birth weight sets you on a developmental trajectory and you're screwed. And there's certain outcomes that you can't avoid. Well, what protective factors this research has demonstrated is that if you have certain protective factors, you're able to be buffered, you're able to be protected from the negative effects of a particular stressor, in this case, low birth weight. And it's not just at the individual level. And I want to make this clear. It's actually very similar to Bronfenbrenner's theory that, there's all these different systems going on and all these environmental factors going on, which contain stressors, but they also contain protective factors. And actually, my good friend found that that's what I'm referencing here. Religiosity in neighborhood collective kind of almost like YMCA, kind of these community centers protected children from poor developmental outcomes in Mobile, Alabama. So again, speaking to like these policies, these community engagements, these economic programs protect children from the worst effects of poverty or racism, etc. So that is, protective factors are personal resources, government support, and supportive postnatal environments. All right, so I'm going to look at a couple of Erikson's stages of development, his psychosocial theory. Again, this is a stage theorist. Trust versus mistrust, and he maintained that the first year to year and a half of life involves the establishment of a sense of trust. Infants are dependent and must rely on others. A caregiver who consistently meets those needs instills a sense of trust or belief. Caregivers should not worry about overindulging a child. So he argues that from birth to 1 year old, the kind of a premier crisis within an infant's life is this trust versus mistrust. And that, as I stated, chapter 2, that if you don't solve this, yeah, you may continue on to the next stage, but you're going to have kind of these lingering long-term effects due to your inability to solve this crisis. So therefore, Erikson argues that an infant between birth and 1 year should just, be, you can't overindulge that infant. You want to build that trust. So next, looking at autonomy versus shame and doubt. Toddlers should be allowed to explore their environment as freely as possible, as safety allows, and in doing so will develop a sense of independence that will later grow to self-esteem, initiative, and overall confidence. So what Erikson is arguing here is that children need to develop autonomy. And if a parent is overreactive, overprotective, then a child will never develop a sense of autonomy. And instead, when a parent kind of tells them, hey, be careful, the child will come to adopt a sense of doubt in their abilities, and they'll be, maybe ashamed of their behavior. And his advice would be, parenting advice based on these ideas would be to keep toddlers safe, but let them learn by doing. One way to measure development in infants is Bailey scale of infant development, and that's shown there. Some of these little like toys. It's a measure of infant intelligence. They measure your motor skill, your cognitive abilities, your motor abilities, and kind of your vocabulary skills. And based on all those skills, it generates some number, it creates some composite number called the general adaptive composite. It summarizes how well, how poorly the infant performs in comparison with a large norm group. So you can see, theoretically, is your child motor skills delayed, for example, or cognitive skills delayed, etc. And finally, some COVID implications. Births in the U.S. during 2020 were down 4% from 2019. Decreases indicate that the pandemic resulted in lower rates of conceptions. With facial max, babies cannot access their visual cues. So which I'm not sure actually how uh, common this is because so many nurseries are closed. But theoretically, if infants were only ever saw, even at home, at all moments of time, only saw, never saw a parent's face, that could theoretically negatively impact development. But that's very unlikely to occur. But there are socialization issues, obviously, during this time period because I mean it's a pandemic, and you see this at all kind of wars or pandemics or natural disasters. Uh, Infants will adapt to the environment that's given to them. That doesn't mean that there's any that there's some destiny that necessarily long-term developmental outcomes, but it's something to keep in mind, and maybe more interaction will be required from certain students in the future. So that's something that just keep in mind. So thanks everyone for listening, and have a great week.